Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yes, good afternoon or good morning, depending on what coast you're joining us from. I want to thank everybody who's logged into today's session a little bit early. We appreciate that. The session is actually going to kick off in about 4 minutes. I just wanted to come on and do a couple of quick announcements leading up to the kickoff of the session. A couple of things real quick. For those of you who joined, I'll re-announce this in just a few minutes, but we do encourage everybody throughout the session today to ask as many questions as you like. I'll point out that the way to ask questions on the GoToWebinar panel is there's a question function down the bottom right-hand side of the webinar panel. You can go ahead and just type your question in there, and at no time during the session are we going to field questions, but when we get to the end, time permitting, what we'll do is we'll read questions out loud and give you and then give the speaker, Joe Franchetti, who's going to be speaking today, an opportunity to answer those questions. We will not read your name. We won't read your company name. We won't give out any personal information. We will simply read out the question. So again, I want to encourage everybody who's on to ask as many questions as you like. If something pops into your head as you're seeing a slide, type it in, and then we'll get to it. Now, if we get a lot of questions, and with today's topic, we tend to get a lot of questions. If we don't get to them, your question in particular, what we do is we'll take all the questions offline, and we'll have those answered and sent back to all attendees in the form of an FAQ document, and that's usually turned around in about a week's time. In addition to that, I'll let everybody know that today's session is being recorded. Once we start the session promptly at 1, we will record the session and make that available as an on-demand video to all the attendees, and you're welcome to share that amongst your peers who perhaps couldn't be joining us today. The session is scheduled for 1 hour. I expect we'll probably go right up to the end of that. We have a lot of content to cover today. So again, I hope that we'll have a few minutes at the end to answer some questions, but again, if we don't, we will tackle those in a follow-up FAQ document. So again, we'll have a brief pause for a minute or so. We'll come back on and we'll do a little countdown, and then we'll go ahead and get the audio and the recording started. But again, for those of you who joined us early, we appreciate you showing up on time and early even, and we appreciate your patience as we await the rest of the attendees and get the session kicked off. Hello, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's session, Navigating Global Regulations and Guidance Around Data Integrity. This presentation today is from Astrix Technology Group, featuring Joe Franchetti, Managing Consultant at JAF Consulting. Again, we want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we're going to go ahead and get the session started. Before we get into the speakers portion of the presentation, we want to give you a brief overview of who Astrix Technology Group is, so that you understand where we're coming from and what our relation to this topic is. So Astrix Technology Group, if you're not familiar with us, is an informatics professional services and staffing company that's dedicated exclusively to serving the scientific community. A couple of quick background statistics on Astrix. The company itself was established in 1995 and is privately held. It originated as an IT division of APBI, which was a $300 million life sciences research organization. Today, Astrix operates throughout the United States and abroad with greater than 500 employees in 8 offices. The headquarters of the company are in Red Bank, New Jersey, and we're broken out into 2 specific divisions. There's a staffing division which offers both private as well as public staffing of scientific and IT resources. And then there's a professional services division. This is a division that typically puts on these webinars, which is focused on supporting a wide array of services and functions in science-based organizations. The target customer for Astrix is life science, enterprise, government, research institutions with large and fast-growing IT staffing and compliance needs. The mission of the company has always been to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions in IT and staffing for the scientific community. In terms of the company's foundation and where our focus is, we help our clients excel and solve complex problems with the right people and the technologies. And there's kind of 3 pieces to this. There's a science, a business, and a technology. Within science, there's a focus on staffing individuals with scientific backgrounds. practical bench experience available, and a broad subject matter expertise. On the business side, there's expertise in laboratory management, laboratory operations, as well as managed services. And then in technology, Astrix has a host of skill sets in a variety of different scientific laboratory applications, from LIMS to ELN, as well as industry standard development and database tools skill sets. So we bring quite a bit to bear in addition to the regular staffing service of staffing laboratory professionals, R&D professionals. There's also this entire technology professional services group. And part of that is we have to oftentimes deal with data integrity. Now, data integrity is, of course, a very hot topic, not only from regulations that have come about from 2015 up through as recent as I think this week, and Joe, our speaker today, will touch on that. And I'm actually going to go ahead and introduce Joe at this point and let him take over the presentation. And Joe will tell you a little bit more about himself, about his company, what they focus on, and how they complement the technology portion of what Astrix does. So Joe, if you want to do a quick introduction to yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. Let me get up the right screen there. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully everyone's doing well today. We are, in for a long session here today. There's a lot of information that we're going to present, and I believe it'll be, very interesting for those of you who are new to this topic, as well as those who are seasoned veterans. Hopefully, we'll introduce a few more components to your tool shed to help you move forward in this this activity. As you know, the abstract there, a little bit about me, a little picture of me that's up there. We have, I've been doing this for over 25 years, and I've been working in, from the laboratory into information technology, quality assurance in the pharma and life science industry. I've been, as JAF, been consulting for over 20 years in that capacity, and I've been involved in many industry groups: ISPE, RAPS, ACS, RQA, and Society of Quality Assurance. In fact, the Society of Quality Assurance, I am heavily involved in the education committee within the organization, as well as the computer validation information technology compliance specialty section, which focuses a lot on automated systems, IT compliance, and meeting the regulators' expectations. A little bit about the company. We've been around for just over 20 years, involved in all aspects of quality assurance. Essentially quality assurance as a service, if you would. We do computer system validation, enterprise system implementation, quality management implementation, as well as systems, training and education, auditing, which includes internal, external type auditing, as well as data integrity assessments. So I have a pretty good track record with working with these types of issues that we're going to present here today. What we're going to focus on, though, is that the global regulations, and although we have a lot of predicate rule, the GMP, GLP, GCP regulations here in the States, there are a lot of other great publications that are out there. So we're going to look at not only the regulations that are out there, but we're going to look at some of the data integrity guidance. As Kevin mentioned, we're going to look at some of the most recent guidance as well. We're going to show how you can meet some of those regulatory expectations with some very basic steps, and then we're going to summarize the session. It shouldn't be too difficult there. Interestingly enough, data integrity is not a new concept. All of the principles from the paper and ink era still apply to electronic systems and data capture and so forth. However, because there are evolving business models and increasing globalization, it makes the process just a little bit more difficult to understand because of those increased use of technologies, and even more so the increasing availability of data and also the usability of that data. So we're getting more and more data. It makes it seem that this is a new concept, but again, all of these concepts have been presented before in previous regulations. I'm going to put up a couple here. We're going to look at the GLPs. Part 58 talks about data handling and storage, along with retrieval of that data. We look at study conduct, about data generated during the conduct of a study. How data should be entered. It should be dated on the date of the entry, signed or initialed by the person entering the data. Changes should be made so that not to obscure the original, indicate the reason for such a change, and shall be dated and signed or identified at the time of change. It talks about automated data collection systems and how the individual responsible for the direct data input should be identified at the time of data input. All these are fairly straightforward, and we've seen them before, right? Description of transformations, calculations, or operations performed of the on the data. Show me what you're going to do to the data, and show me what the calculations are, and make sure that it works, right? Again, 58.190 talks about storage. The GMPs have just as many points. There's a lot more in the GLPs, but we don't want to belabor that regulation too much. GMPs have, starting out, instruments must be qualified and fit for purpose. Software must be validated. Data generated and transformed must meet the criterion for scientific soundness. Data and the reportable value must be checked by a second individual to ensure accuracy, completeness, and conformance with procedures. Now, these are written, many years ago with the GMPs as well. Get into more on 21.11.194 that control records should include complete data derived from all tests conducted to ensure compliance with the established specification standard, including examinations, assays as follows. So what we want to look at here is focusing on what is that complete data, right? Complete data has a pretty straight definition. It's not only the raw data, that first use of that data, or observations generated during the course of the analysis. It's all that contextual metadata, all that data about a data. The value of 35 means absolutely nothing unless you attribute it to either a sample weight, a patient ID, a unit of measure, as well as any other information that could go along with that. And then when you get to the last part of it, if data can be changed, that audit trail that shows how that data has been modified, or why it has been modified, and who it has been modified by. Now, audit trails are fairly simple when you look at that piece of paper, or should be. You should see who made the change, when they made it, and the reason for that change. In electronic systems, it's not so easy to identify where those changes have been made unless they've been designed appropriately. Even the ICH for GCP talks about the design, conduct, and performance of clinical trials, provides assurance that data and reported results are credible, accurate, and the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of trial subjects are protected. Now, if we start looking at, we can pull out each one of these components in these regulations, and we'll see as we get further into this, when we start looking at some of these data integrity guidance, where it's pointing specifically to, the accurate, the confidentiality, how confidentiality can be protected, and so forth in these systems. Now, there are a number of electronic records, regulations, standards, and guidance out there. We have 21 CFR Part 11. Obviously, that's been around. It's just over 20 years old, and certainly has not changed any since its initial release. Although they have indicated they wanted to make a change a few years ago, but we have heard no rumblings of that activity. get into the guidance of scope and application, which was a very good document, but it also added some confusion to the record and signature rule. So it's out there, and as much as I would love to be able to go into each one of these and give you a very specific outline of each of them, certainly the information's here, and if you have any need, you certainly can request some of these documents up online. You Google search each one of them. An interesting one, though, as we get into this, obviously ISPE's Guide to the Good Automated Manufacturing Practice, GAMP 5, which was released in February 2008. Although it's not specific to electronic records, has a very solid section on managing electronic records and electronic signatures. There are Japanese Ministry of Health, as well as some ISO IEC documents there as well. All great documents, and these are all great resources for you to use. That Japanese Ministry of Health Labor and Welfare document, it talks to, in the translations that we've read over the years, it talks to data and raw data for submission, and it really focuses on that raw data concept. We have Edulux, which is more Annex 11, drives into the document from the EU. Talks about good documentation, part of a quality assurance system, key to operating in a compliance with GMP requirements. Right. Annex 11 also requires critical data that enters manually, a second check. And if you look back in some of the other regulations that I read, where we look for that, that's coming from one of the US FDA regulations. Annex 11 has about, I want to say there's about 16 specific recommendations in this document that talks about risk management, formal agreements, and quality agreements. Talks about validation of the systems and the documentation that cover the life cycle. It addresses clear printouts, system-generated audit trails. It gets into the concept of periodic evaluation, which is an excellent concept, as the life of these systems sometimes take on their own entity. And when you go back and review these systems and start looking at whether or not they maintain their validated state, you come to find that through change control or multiple change controls may have moved this system out of that regulated or validated state. So it's very, very great concept that they put into Annex 11. Talks about physical and logical controls and how they need to be put in place to maintain the restricted access to computerized systems. Talks about incident management and qualified persons. What is a qualified person? Well, what are their credentials? What should they have? And especially if you're using electronic signature, how do you verify that? So, along with data backups and managing data integrity through that method, that's only one component of it. All of these other components that Annex 11 talks about, the other 14 other components, it is what drives a lot of these data integrity. Now, when you look back on Annex 11, it was back in 2011 that was released. So, a good foresight into the the way that we should manage these systems. Again, nothing that is new is really being presented in any of these documents. Good documentation practices. they're a core of any quality organization, and it's certainly good documentation practices are certainly a cultural process. I've been, our organization works in, from sterile manufacturing all the way down to, if you would consider it regulated, the e-liquid space. And although they all have the same requirements for good documentation practices, certainly they all don't follow the same rules, right? So it's very good to make sure that we have all those good documentation practices in place as well. Next set is all these data integrity guidance. First one listed here was probably the kickoff of all of the documents. MHRA put together the GMP data integrity definitions and guidance for industry back in March of 2015, and we'll talk about that one specifically, which is why it is highlighted. The next one up would be the World Health Organization has a guidance on good data and record management practices that was released in 2016, and then shortly after that, the FDA released their draft guidance document back in April of 2016. So we're just about 2 years removed from that release of that document, and we have not seen any updates to it or heard anything about it, but we'll talk a little bit about that document. We'll briefly talk about this document as well, the PICS guidance on good practice for data management integrity in regulated GMP and GDP environments. It was released in August. EMA put together a questions and answers document in August. NIST put together their publication on data integrity, recovering from ransomware and other destructive events. So they're looking at it from a position of cybersecurity and ransomware attacks and how you can recover from those, which is a different position than what the pharma industry is taking. However, we still need to do the same type of processes, right? We're not really talking about ransomware there in our industry. GAMP has put together a records and data integrity document back in March of 2017. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the rewrite, which is in progress of being released. They did a significant rewrite of that document, and it should be released, I think, sometime by the summer. But it is, unfortunately, I can't talk too much about it, other than saying it is extremely comprehensive. It was close to 150 pages of text and images. So they do a great job at really getting into the weeds of the different sections that they're touching on. And then last but not least is the MHRA's GXP Data Integrity Guidance and Definitions document. It stays in line pretty much with their first guidance document. The draft was released back in I want to say April of 2016, somewhere around there. But the final just came out last Friday. So as much as I'm going to be able to go through this, it's probably another topic in another webinar, because it's a fairly comprehensive document, and we certainly can go through it. We're going to touch on some highlights as we go through it, but it's certainly a full day of or a full hour of content. So let's look at the MHRA data integrity definitions and guidance for industry from March. So they set the expectation that the pharmaceutical manufacturers, importers, and contract laboratories, as part of their self-inspection program, must review the effectiveness of their governance systems to ensure data integrity and traceability. That was their introduction to it. That was their the way they started this document out. They look at other parts of their programs from Chapter 9 of the EU GMPs, as well as their own internal audits that they should be focusing on. They look at not only the internal component of this, which is extremely important, but we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the external, what are we doing to ensure that other organizations are meeting the expectations of this guidance, which is extremely important to understand. Again, we can go back to looking at some of the early FDA guidance on computer system validation, and probably well before Red Apple, probably to the Blue Book before that, where it took the onus off of the actual sponsors doing the validation activities, but also looking at the folks that are using the system, the folks that develop the system, and the folks that manage the system. So all which could be, in today's world, a different entity, right? Issued back in January, updated in March. Essentially it has 19 definitions and expectations. One of the nice things it introduces the term of Alcoa Plus, which we'll go through in a couple of slides. But one of the key points that it touches on is that you should be designing these systems to ensure data quality and integrity, and that they essentially give a little bit of thought into how these systems are being designed. Now, we know that as an organization or a sponsor, we have no bearing on how systems that we purchase are designed. We can only ask for the different components. But this is a great guidance for any software development firm that's developing a software application to look back on and say, hey, maybe we should consider some of these things. Now, access to clocks and the synchronization of clocks across the system for timed events. Now, this is extremely critical in manufacturing. It could also be critical, and I try to draw and extrapolate this to other areas as well. Although this is focused on GMP, and although the regulations, the GLPs, GCPs, GMPs, and all the other global regulations all talk about computer systems. When I think about computer systems, there really isn't a regulatory driver behind them. All these regulations kind of say the same thing for each of the different disciplines. So, if you're in GLP or GCP, looking at this one component is extremely important. How does it relate to what you do? Think outside of the box. This is how designing these systems need to be. What are your critical thinking skills to think around each one of these systems and how it applies, right? Here is accessibility of batch records at locations where the activity takes place, so that the ad hoc data recording and later transcription to official records is not necessary. Access control over blank paper templates. Now, data integrity isn't just an electronic systems thing, right? If you think back on each one of your paper forms that you have in your laboratory, in your organization, that you use to conduct a study or manufacturing, or any logbook or log sheet that you use, there's a lot of information on there. And this gets back to that good documentation practices, right? No blank lines, no pencil, indelible ink, and most organizations will go blue or black. But we run across many organizations that still use pencil, that still use whiteout, that still cross out, that still leave blank spots. Very, very important as you look at these. It's not just an electronic system problem. User rights, which prevent audit trail, or data amendments. If you can make a change, is that change being logged? Should it be logged? We're not talking about, in here, we're not talking about the specific transaction logs or transaction activity of a system where it goes from a blank cell to a valued cell or captured cell. We're talking about having that value in there and making a change to it from a 1 to a 2 or 1 to a 0.1. That's what we're looking at when we talk about audit trail. But even more importantly, do the individuals that make those changes have the unilateral ability to make them without any other decision process? That's extremely important. That's what we talk about user access rights. Automated data capture around printer, around balances, and around excuse me, around pH meters. How are we capturing that value? Is it tied into a LIMS? And if so, is that interface correct? Is it tied into a printer? Is that printer a printer that will maintain data integrity? A lot of printers that are out there, they're moving more to ink-based printers, but previously they were the thermal transfer printers. And in laboratories and manufacturing systems, they're not working all that well. Anything gets wet or heat, it gets rid of the values there. Proximity of the printers to the relevant activities, control of the physical parameters to look at each one of those performance of tasks, and then last we have access to raw data for staff performing the data checking activities. Right, and this is where as we look into the more current guidance, we focus on data review, data review processes, data review procedures, and do we have access to that raw data or any of the other audit trail that is particular to that. So it's very important. And this document was pretty good a couple of years ago, and it still holds well now. So here's Alcoa Plus. Alcoa we know as attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate, which is defined there. But they added the complete, consistent, enduring, and available to this, where complete is all data, including repeat analysis performed on a sample. So if you're running an analysis and you get a result that's bad, do you have traceability to that information, or is it blinded from the report? Right? Consistent application of data time spans in the expected sequence. Are we applying things consistently across the system? And then enduring, record in a permanent, maintainable form for the useful life and the medium used to record the data. So, as I mentioned previously with balances, if you have a thermal transfer paper, that may not be maintained for the useful life. Maybe for the immediate, and address contemporaneous, but it may not be for the life of that record, which you have to look at. And then last but not least is the available component. Available and accessible for review, audit for the lifetime of the record. Oh, we know in manufacturing it's pretty long. And even when we get into GLP and GCP, it's long there. A lot of cases that I'm seeing where we're looking at clinical laboratories that do testing for clinical trials, they have at least here in the U.S., as well as even in Europe with GDPR and things like that, they have a 2-year limit on maintaining records. Well, that doesn't support any of our record retention practices for clinical trial data. So we have to make sure that that is addressed when we start looking at these electronic systems, or even manual processes, to ensure that data is available over the course of the record. Right. So it's a good addition to the Alcoa, and certainly EMEA's also put in some of these concepts in their guidance as well, their question and answers. Talks about the data integrity requirement to apply equally to manual and electronic data. At the end of the day, that we want to make sure that there's awareness of these issues, right? We'll be, this is, although this is manufacturing GMP, this can be applicable to any of the regulatory expectations that we have. Right. Interestingly enough, they introduced what's called the original data spectrum in this guidance, and it talks about simple to complex systems. And when you look at pH meters and balances, they fall on the lower end, and then you start looking at whether or not printouts could suffice as the raw data in the system. And on the simple scale, they certainly could represent the original data, but as you get out to the complex component with limb systems, chromatography systems, more complex software, not as necessarily represent the entire data set, because you can't print out all of that data. There's too much of a cross and a matrix of the information that's presented there. But this was interesting that they put this visual together, because what they're trying to show is that as you get more complex in your types of equipment and systems and processes, that you're going to have more inherent risks into data integrity, right? So when you talk about more configurability and the ability of data to be manipulated a little bit more, the more complex these systems are, the higher your data integrity risk may be. That was about 2015, 2016. FDA said, hey, we have to step up. We have to put some documentation together to say, hey, we're on board with this data integrity buzzword as well. So they put together a draft guidance on data integrity and compliance with CGMPs, right? So this was it's a draft guidance. It's a Q&A style. As much as I'd like to delve into every component of it, it's still draft, right? I don't like to comment too much on draft documents, because things change, and we'll point that out in the next document that we go through in the new MHRA document. When this is final, it's supposed to represent the FDA's current thinking on data integrity and GMP compliance. Some good highlights in here that they introduced were about metadata being used to reconstruct GMP data, and talking about cloud infrastructure. One of the first documents really to address working with cloud computing and cloud systems, even maintaining data in the cloud. Right. So the guidance, and I'll mention, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a part of SQA, and SQA has what's called a rapid response team. And when there are draft guidance that are presented and need comment, the team will put together their general comments on how this guidance should be modified. And what I'm going to do is present a couple of those to you, because they're very good and pretty much on point. So instead of just looking at GMP, we think that the agency should address GXP across GLP, GCP, pharmacovigilance, as well as the GMP area, which was addressed recently with the MHRA document, right? We feel that they should, introduce or continue the concept of Alcoa Plus, available, enduring, complete, and consistent. I think that's very important in the growth. They talk about Alcoa, but they don't bring in the additional part of that. There are a lot of terms in all of these documents, and there's really no consistency in trying to come up with a true definition across each one of these organizations. So we're looking, the suggestion was to add a glossary of terms. So you can look at that. Hopefully that'll make its way in there. Expand to discuss areas where a documented risk-based approach is acceptable. And I think the risk-based approach is what everyone is working toward, especially around data integrity. How much do we need to do to ensure the integrity of our data? We can't protect against all risks, but we can try to mitigate as many as we can, right? They focus a lot on the paper and not necessarily electronic principles. Or I'm sorry, they focus on the electronic and don't look at the paper as the previous guidance did, right? Previous guidance looked at, not only the electronic means, but the manual and paper processes. So I think it needs to be looked at, because there are still, wherever there's a human involved, there's bound to be some inherent risk, right? And when you look at that manual process, there's always a manual process. Nothing is truly fully automated, so should certainly be looked at. So, of these, of the document itself, and addressing some of these 5 bullet points, I think is very important. Interestingly enough, taking to this newest guidance document that's out there, they addressed a lot of that stuff, right? They looked at that. What we're going to do is we're going to walk through the table of contents there. We're going to make some comments as we go through. The document itself talks about the principles of data integrity and lays out a number of principles that are very good. And in there, talks about organizational culture and responsibilities of management, which is extremely important. Talks about looking at moving between paper and electronic records and flipping between the two of them, thinking that you'll mitigate some of those data integrity issues, when in reality you're probably creating more, right? So it talks a lot about that principles behind the data integrity. And the second section, it talks about data criticality and inherent integrity risk. And there are varying levels of risk in each one of the different components. It talks about paper, it talks about electronic, it talks about hybrid systems. But more so, it talks about the design of some of these systems. So, in one of the sections, it is expected to consider not only a computerized system, but also supporting people, guidance, training, and quality systems. How's data recorded? How's data managed and processed? It's looking at the entire activity. The next session talks more about the designing of a system. How are we putting those systems together? Are we giving consideration to the access, the usability, and location, while ensuring the appropriate control of all of the data? Talks about definitions and definition of data, raw data, metadata, data integrity, governance, lifecycle. Pretty straightforward in a lot of those definitions. Nothing that's surprising. Data, they talk about Alcoa. They talk about the metadata that's associated with samples or values. The data lifecycle, which is really important to understand how that data flows through your different workflows, and when is its end of life, when is its beginning of life. Data processing is also a part of that. When do you exclude data, and how can you exclude data? Talks about the original record and true copies, about audit trail signatures, all which are addressed. If you take this guidance and you go back into Annex 11 and a lot of the regulations that I pointed in the beginning of the presentation, if you go back to the previous guidance from MHRA and even into the FDA's guidance and look at each one of these components, it's they're all pretty much being addressed there. Data retention, and what it looks at is what is an archive and what is a backup. A backup is not an archive of your data. An archive is taking it offline. An archive is saying I can delete this from the system because I'm able to retrieve not only the data, but all the contextual metadata that surrounds it, right? And have it have some value and some meaning when you restore that data. Interesting, they talk about file structures and how file structures, as they move through the process, may be changed and modified. And even more importantly, do you have access to that file structure? Can you change anything within that file as you move it forward? Right? Validation for intended purpose. Now, Annex 11, Annex 15 have similar type of references, but we're looking at how is that system going to be used? Is that system going to be used for specific functionality? If that functionality is there, great. If there's additional functionality there, can you remove that functionality from the system? Can you mask the use of that process? Do you have the proper documentation? When we talk about validation from the planning stages and requirements definition all the way through the objective evidence in your release memo. Are you looking at it as proper access control? That's our first line of defense in data integrity and part of design, right? If we're identifying these systems even more. And as I said it before, as when this document was in draft, that last section wasn't even a part of the document. It had nothing to do about IT suppliers and service providers or cloud computing at all. Our thought is that they pulled some of the information from the FDA guidance and incorporated that into the final document. When we start looking at some of the draft guidance, there's a section around designing systems that had a very similar system complexity diagram. They removed that diagram from the final document. It's a great document to read. Great, it's probably I'm going to say 20 pages, 25 pages of content. It's reading, on a weekend, Sunday morning when you're drinking your coffee, and pick it up. It's a great document. I'm sure I'll be putting together a webinar that gets deeper into each one of the components that this guidance document talks about in the future. So with all this, these are all expectations that we've passed in the documents that we just reviewed and that I presented in summary.
Joe, I'm just going to give you a 10-minute warning, okay?
Sure, thank you. We're meeting these regulatory expectations. How are we going to get from 0 to 80 in compliance, right? A lot of these data integrity issues happen. Why? Well, there's time, there's pressure, time constraints, pressure constraints. fear of mistakes. If you try not to make a mistake, chances are Murphy's Law will say that you're going to make that mistake. Or is it a culture or an accepted behavior? And when you look at that culture, a lot of things you can fix systems, you can fix processes, you can fix all of your procedures. But culture has a lot of influence of people, right? Can you fix those people? How do you change that behavior? How do you create a culture of quality, right? I think it's of the old, it's never going to happen to us. We're just going to ignore it. We're going to move forward and not worry about it. Well, chances are one of those 8 bullets on the side are one of the keys to why data integrity issues happen within your organization. What we're going to do is look at a couple data integrity risk factors and how we can really move through this. And this is based on the premise of the ICHG 9, the Quality Risk Management Program, right? We look at assessment, mitigation, control, communication, and review, right? We're going to look at this in a different light. We're going to look at, predicting. How can we predict and access the most likely data integrity breaches, by looking at different vulnerabilities in the system. So here we're going to assess, right? We're going to look and see what we need to do to correct, to fix. It's a preemptive measure. But we all know, and I can see most of you shaking your heads, none of us do this. None of us are in that preemptive strike. We're in the reaction mode, right? So as we get through this, we start looking at, how do we prevent them? We can train employees, we can give them how to handle data properly and how to report data properly. We can, show them our corporate values and company values and code of conducts. But that's not always the best and most complete. Next we can design and validate systems and add security to the systems, right? We have to look at the data lifecycle when we start doing that. We have to identify what the critical data is and what the critical records are. We have to look at backup and recovery, right? Each of these, are important as part of the design and validation of systems, and adding, the security to them certainly helps as well. When you get to looking at design, it's interesting that a clever design can truly reduce the likelihood of data integrity issues arising from the execution of these systems and processes. You look at the data requirements through its life cycle. What are your high-risk system requirements? Where are your failure points? Designing robust archiving, your backup processes. More important, how do you restore? Can you restore? What's your data recovery process? I'd be very surprised that a lot of organizations that are running a lot of significantly large systems do not focus on data recovery or disaster recovery. The focus of access controls and audit trail. Right? If you're using e-signature and making sure e-signature's implemented in there. When we talk about security, we're not just talking about access control to the system. The physical security. Can someone break the system somehow? And even more important is that cybersecurity. Right? How can we protect against that process? So all that stuff is very important. And I mentioned earlier about external sources. Your contractors, your vendors that handle a lot of your services. Quality agreements and put them in place are very, very important in the prevention of these issues. Right? Then we look at detecting. How do we detect all these issues? Well, most of it is through audit, right? Independent audit programs, whether it's internal or external auditors coming in, periodic audits of different components or different different parts of the process, hopefully we'll identify some of the data integrity issues. When we talk about data review, how are we reviewing data? Do we have those processes defined to review data? That's very, very important. And are we reviewing the audit trail when we're reviewing data? Not only the audit trail for the particular data, how about the system administrative audit trail? Is that ever being reviewed to make sure that system access isn't being changed without authorization? And then last but not least, we have our respond, which is where most of us are in, right? How do we develop these processes, efficient management and efforts to develop policy and address audit findings and produce corrective actions? We talk about data governance in this component and the corrective actions that are there. So all of it's pretty good. And when you look at all of these together, there's your data integrity strategy, your policy, how you handle all of that, right? When we talk about data governance, it should address data ownership throughout the life cycle of that data, right? And consider the design, operation, and monitoring of each of these processes in order to comply with the principles of data integrity, including the control over intentional and unintentional changes into that information, right? And here, each of these bullets or each of these circles represent different components of that. Interesting, and you talk about governance and risk, and this is some part from the draft guidance, the PICS guidance, right? An indicator of data governance maturity is an organizational understanding and acceptance of residual risk, which prioritizes actions. An organization which believes that there is no risk of data integrity failure is unlikely to have made an adequate assessment of the inherent risks in their data lifecycle. That's very interesting. No, that's almost pleading ignorance when you think that there are no problems within your organization. So there are some steps to ensure data integrity, right? Embed the data integrity verifications into your internal audit process. Make sure we're looking at that as part of our internal audit activities. Enforce those good documentation practices. Train auditors to understand what to look for when looking for DI deficiencies. Awareness of staff is most important. And I saw on the list there are a couple of companies here that have multiple people who are attending, which is great. It's all about awareness. Seek external support to assure completely unbiased third-party investigations and to enhance your internal investigation program. So a good 5 steps. So we're going to move to a summary. So regardless of the regulatory authorities that are out there, EMEA, you have MHRA, FDA, WHO, NIST, all these different organizations. They all have the same flavor, the same underlying and foundational components around terminology and discussions about technological controls, right? So that's very important that we're aware of that. Compliance with these systems and electronic data integrity is predicated on the complexity of system design. Systems are designed, pretty good, but there are some, it's surprising. SAP out of the box does not have all of the controls that everybody believes that it does. And if you don't implement all of the correct controls, next thing you know, you're going to have a very wide open system that is not only wide open to your organization, but wide open to the external forces that are there. One thing we must all understand the use of these electronic systems within our organization and implement these controls for the data integrity, because controls prevent data integrity issues and they also can detect those issues. So if we identify as we walk through a number of the controls in this presentation, certainly we should be able to address it. Data integrity is maintained through processes, procedures, and training and diligence. Right, that's one thing that you're constantly making people aware. You're constantly showing people what needs to be done. System use and maintenance procedures with data integrity built in, strict adherence to those procedures. When it drives me crazy when I go to audits and individuals feel that they can make changes to the process without making the change to the procedure. It happens though, and as I say, Vigilance is regular training for everyone and make it around data integrity topics. I know labs that have had monthly meetings and used everything as a learning experience. And that's extremely important in this process, is that we take a learning and we grow from it, and we don't have that fear, right? So overall, data integrity success is not a journey. It's a journey. It's not a destination. We can't get there without taking these small steps. We'll eventually get there, but we're not going to get there tomorrow. All right. So that should be it. I know I'm a couple of seconds.
You're fine, Joe. You're fine. It's content that's worth going to the wire for. So I appreciate that, Joe. And again, some contact information for Joe in his practice is up on the screen there. We'll leave that up there for just a moment. And again, a few questions that have come in that I can answer real quick, and we'll go ahead and stop the recording.